There, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Carl Schmitt. And we're focusing this time, we're still continuing Carl Schmitt's parliamentary book. His book on the translation is called the Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy, right? Which is his Parlamentarismus. No, this is the actual German title is a little different than the translated title, but Alan Kennedy's translation has been pretty good. We've looked at chapter 2 last time. I broke up chapter 2 because it had sections and we broke it up a little bit. I'm not going to do that with chapter 3. We're just going to go one shot deal. So let's go do it. This chapter focuses on dictatorship. Now, why dictatorship? Now, it's dictatorship in Marxist thought. So wait a minute. Why dictatorship? In fact, this echoes the book on dictatorship that he wrote earlier in, I think it's 1920. I think what is dictatorship is, my book copy is around here someplace. I don't know. I can grab it right now. But dictatorship 22, yeah, 1922, if I remember correctly. This book is around the same time as dictatorship. This book originally published, it's 1923 and then re-edited 1926, right? So this is about a year. He's written this basically just after his dictatorship, Schmitt's book on dictatorship. So now he's raised, and the question of parliamentarism has a crisis. That is, remember the thing about this is that that the liberal constitutional state is being challenged because of democracy, particularly mass democracy, and that the parliamentary model, the legislative state through the parliamentary, in other words, the framing of liberalism, the bourgeois liberalism that shapes the 19th century model that led to its move away from absolutism, the rise of parliamentary bodies, and democracy. This intersect between democracy and parliamentarism seems at the top as the rise of mass society seems to lead to a kind of that liberalism and democracy are being are now kind of diverging as you bring in something like Marxist thought into this, right? So this is why this is why Schmitt will bring in Marxist thought and the concept of dictatorship as a challenge to parliamentary systems, right? Constitutional parliamentarism has had its classic period on the European continental and the bourgeois monarchy of Louis Philippe and its classical representative of Guizot. Now, Guizot is a very famous French thinker, statesman, legal statesman. Books on, I mean, you can go look at on Liberty Fund publishes his book on representative government, which is very, very important because this is where his defense of parliamentary structures and representative institutions are. And this is the intersect between liberalism and representative institutions, right? And that this is the height of it. Now he says, right? For it, the ancient monarchy and aristocracy were defeated, and the approach of democracy appeared a chaotic storm against which a dam had to be built. So in other words, the democratic. This is the idea that democracy is too chaotic, and it's going to be problematic because of it. Pure mass participatory democracy is going to be too chaotic. It's the classic argument of the ancients against the democratic order of Athens, right? That's the Plato, that democracy is just the mob, and the mob is chaotic. It cannot produce good policy. It's the rule of the ignorant over the wise, and therefore this is why representative institutions is the mechanism, as a dam against the chaos of democracy, right? So the constitutional parliamentary monarchy of the bourgeoisie hovered between these two things, monarchy and democracy, right? That this liberal constitutionalist bourgeoisie liberal parliamentary model is between the absolute monarch and the massive chaos of democracy. All social questions were to be resolved by parliament in rational, open debate. The term just Milo, well, this is that famous, it's a French word. This is French, so hold on for a second. I just want to make sure I was right. Happy medium, right? My French is weak. I need to remove my French. I haven't been reading French actively for a couple of months, so therefore, my I just wanted to make sure I was right. Happy medium. The whole world of the middle state, this middle position. I mean, this is why someone I know at Indiana at Cocteau always talk about this middle position. This is why this idea of medium, this bourgeois liberalism. This is why uh, 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 he is the editor of the book on represent. He edited Guizot's Representative Democracy. He champions. He always argues for moderation. Uh, 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 um, um, and again, this is the problem, but this is the thing about this happy medium, right? And principled compromise, right? This is the bourgeois mentality. Everything's debatable. Everything's like this, and there's in other words, there's this moderation, spirit of moderation, of fitting moderation, and principled compromise. This is the bourgeois. This is this a moment here, right? In opposition to parliamentary constitutionalism, in opposition to parliamentary constitution, not democracy. The idea of a dictatorship that would sweep away parliamentarism regained its topicality. So therefore, it's the dictatorship is seen as the antithesis, or in other words, constitutionalism, parliamentary constitutionalism, is that the rule of law and procedures and institutions that it's not the opposition of this to democracy, an opposition to dictatorship is not an opposition to democracy. The argument is here, but rather dictatorship is an opposition to liberalism, liberal parliamentarism. Okay, this is the interesting point. This is a regained its topicality. In other words, this argument is that in opposition to this, and not to democracy, that dictatorship would sweep away parliament. In other words, away parliamentarism regained its topicality. The critical year 1848 stood as a year of democracy and of dictatorship at the same time. Right, this a moment, the dictatorship and democracy at this moment. Both stood in opposition to the bourgeois liberalism of parliamentary thought. Again, this is that line. I was going to look at the note. It's always fun to read the notes in that sense. Um, I just put my lights on. I'm sorry. I should put it up there, but I can't do it up there because I don't want to go back and forth with it. July Revolution. It's a translator's line. This is a note from the translator, not Schmitt. The July Revolution in Paris, 1830, led to the abdication of Charles X. Louis the Philippe, citizen king, succeeded him, inaugurated the golden age of the bourgeoisie. Right, 18 years later, in February, the election in Paris led to Louis Philippe's own abdication and the establishment of the French Republic under Louis Napoleon, the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. The same year, 1848, Marx and Engels published the Communist Manifesto. Europe's conservative order was shaken by a series of riots and revolutions. The social uprising in June was brutally repressed by the authorities in Paris. And it is to this conflict of class interest between the bourgeoisie on one side and the peasants and the workers on the other that Schmitt refers to when he says in opposition to parliamentary constitution, not democracy, right? See Karl Marx's The Class Struggle. Marx wrote about this in his an essay, The Class Struggles in France, 1848 to 1850, in the Marx-Engels Volume 1 reader, and it's like it works, Volume 1, but Russian edition, Moscow published it. So, we got this. My God, we were only at the first page. Can you like that? Okay, I'm sorry. I'm doing. So this is what this whole point about is. Discussing between engaging in principled negotiations, this thought stood between two adversaries who opposed it with such energy that the very idea of mediating the discussion appeared to be only an interim between bloody battles. In other words, this, how can you in this contestation between um, this class, bourgeois, this and animosity between a conservative reaction, this war between the forces of the reaction versus the peasants and revolutionary socialists and peasants together against the bourgeoisie, who sided, out of fear of the peasants, sided with, and the masses sided with the reactionary forces, and therefore this is that idea of the sense of this is of this. Both opponents answered with a destruction of balance, with an intermediacy and absolute certainty, with dictatorship. Okay, in other words, that both sides, the fearing the dangers of the mob, needed to crush the mob, and fearing the power of the bourgeoisie and with their allies, and that you needed power to destroy them, right? And both sides sought to dominate and do the other, right? There is, to use crude catchwords, for a provisional characterization, to use the crude catchwords for a provisional characterization, a dogma of rationalism and another of irrationalism. So therefore, this is crude characterization. A dogma of rationalism, the parliamentary argument, is a dogma that rational discussion and rational things should do. And then with both the reactionary and also the revolutionary model is a kind of irrationalism, right? For the dictatorship born of the unmediated rationalism that is absolutely certain in its own terms. A long term tradition already lays its hand. The Enlightenment's educational dictatorship. This is again, you have to remember the Enlightenment was not a fan of democracy. Remember, look who the Enlightened rulers, like Voltaire, does not champion democracy. Does not just moderate government. He champions autocrats, be it Frederick or be it Catherine. Right? This is Voltaire does not champion moderate regimes. These absolute rulers, right? So this educational dictatorship, right? The philosophical Jacobins, right? The Jacobins of this idea. And the Jacobins are not like you have to understand. Jacobin is Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety. Okay, uh, the tyranny of reason, right? That sense. A formal unity springs from the rationalist and classical spirits, an alliance of philosophy with the sword. Now, Schmitt has a note here, and I think this is a Schmitt note. In this alliance during the 19th century, as one of the alliance in which the church, philosophy played only a modest role, but nonetheless, it cannot so soon renounce its alliance. This is a further see H. Pickler's The Philosophy of Geistesgeschichtliche Society, and that's 1922. So he points to a recent book that highlights this aspect. Most of the other notes are just basically of this. So with Napoleon's defeat, this tradition appeared to be finished, overcome theoretically and more morally by a newly awakened historical sense. By which Napoleon? I think Napoleon's, the first Napoleon, not the second, not Louis. In other words, Napoleon's defeat by this tradition appears to be finished, right? Overcome theoretically and morally by a newly awakened historical sense. But the possibility of a rationalist dictatorship always remained in a historical philosophic form and lived on as a political idea. Its upholder was a radical Marxist socialist whose ultimate metaphysical proof was built on the basis of Hegel's historical logic. In other words, this idea of the master-slave dialectic, right? The master-mastery. And that the idea of this idea of this, looking at the logic of dialectic, you understand the master-slave dialectic in that sense. You saw the domination and the role of domination of each class, a dialectic class, that one that overpowers and establishes itself, right? This is and Marx takes what is metaphysical and turns it into materialist in terms of classes, right? That's the whole point about this. Just because socialism moved from utopia to science does not mean that it renounced dictatorship. It is a remarkable symptom that few radical socialists and anarchists have believed since since the World War, that they must go back to a utopia so that socialism can regain its courage for dictatorship. This demonstrates how profoundly science has ceased to be the obvious foundation of social practice for the current generation. But it does not prove that the possibility of a dictatorship is no longer open to scientific socialism, right? The word scientific must only be correctly understood and not limited to mere precise natural scientific technology. In other words, science is not terms. In other words, this is not the term science is not should be limited to our understanding to a precise natural scientific terminology. The philosophy of the natural science cannot, of course, provide a foundation for dictatorship, just as it could not for any other political institutions of authority. In other words, the natural sciences do not give a kind of um, this is kind of a fact value problem in this, that the is ought reality, right, does not provide the natural sciences cannot provide a foundation for this or any other political institution or authority. The rationalism of scientific socialism goes much further than the natural science could possibly do. So it's no longer that. In it, the rationalist faith in the Enlightenment has been vastly outdone and taken a new, almost fanatical jump. The Enlightenment has the absolutism and defense of absolute monarchy that the Enlightenment presented now takes an even more fantastic jump for scientific socialism. It had it been able to retain its own energy, it would have certainly had been comparable in intensity with the rationalism of the Enlightenment. So one, this is right. This is that thing. The Marxist one. Marxist science is metaphysics. So first of all, Marxist science is metaphysics. That's the first assumption. This is his point here. Only when it is scientifically formulated, socialism believed itself in possession of an essentially infallible truth. And just at that moment, it claimed the right to use force. In other words, once it held an absolute truth, an infallible truth, then at that same moment it had access to that as an infallible truth, then it claimed the right to use force to achieve it. The scientific certainty of socialism appeared historically after 1848. That is, after socialism has become a political power that could hope to realize its ideas one day. In this kind of science, if in this kind of science, practical and theoretical conceptions mingle. This kind of new science, these two things, practical and theoretical, mingle. Very often, scientific socialism meant only a negative, the rejection of utopia and the determination from then on to intervene consciously in social and political realities. Right? So in other words, originally the scientific socialism meant At first, we're gonna abandon idealism, utopianism, and idealism, but rather deal concretely in social and political reality, right? Instead of being conceived from the outside according to fantasies and splendid ideas, social and political reality was to be analyzed from within, according to its actual and correctly understood imminent circumstances. Here, it is a matter of looking for the ultimate and in the and in an intellectual sense, decisive argument among the many sides and possibilities of socialism for the evidence of socialist belief. Right? So, therefore, what is the justification? In other words, in other words, instead of just having ideals, well, look at reality and what is the justification that justifies socialist beliefs? Okay, in that sense, right? Convinced Marxism, convinced Marxism holds that it has found the true explanation for social, economic, and political life, and that a correct praxis, praxis means action, right? A praxis, and that German Greek word praxis means action. So action, followed from that knowledge. So theory, praxis, right? Theoretical, and praxis. Theory and praxis, right? This is the Greek conception. See, the original Greek conception of praxis means the contingent. That theoretical means the always there, the always. I mean, this is the problem with these terms and how the Germans understood them. Kant is the big, look at Kant. See, for Kant, it's no longer praxis; it becomes no long. It becomes merely the concrete and actualized in everydayness, right? For the Greeks, it meant originally praxis meant that state of contingency. Okay, where theoria was that state of always being so, that it's something always being, that something was simply that this at this level there's a level of simplicity here, and that things either are or are not, right, and they're always that. Okay, whereas the level of praxis was that of coming to be and passing away, and therefore there was contingency and other things like this. So, whereas Kant, and I think this is the problem, is we have to understand this is a post-Kantian problem, that this idea of theory imposes itself. Theory now manifests itself. The truth of theory tells us a way to understand what happens in actual practice. Whereas the Greeks said, no, 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 there's two different rationalities there, there's two levels. Or here, it is from a in fact, the rationality that emerges, reasoning that emerges from praxis, is a emergent rationality, not a top down, but a bottom up. Here, from Kant onwards, it is an ontological top down conception of this. And Marxism is therefore following Hegel, following this. It may understand itself like this, but it's still this theory imposes, it explains the reality, and therefore reality here, yes, its theory is something that it explains and understands it by facing reality. So yes, it's only within the scape, and we remove the what this sense. What we do is remove the eternal and only look at this, but then understand this in a way of true and falsehood, validity and not validity, in a way that is, in other words, this is the problem, the lens. This is Nietzsche's critique of this, would be that this is the false lens. We impose on the contingent a, a, a uniformity that is simply not possible. And hence, this is why this is a problem in that sense. This is why Marxism is an all kind of dogmatic science. This idea that we get a simple, valid theory that explains everything always. Well, what does that mean? This is a problem in that sense. This is that this is a truth that does it. Okay, yeah, that might be interesting. That there is some kind of aspect of to that of knowledge, practical knowledge, but it's a practical science, right? And this is what this aspect of this is in a sense, right? Um, um, okay, let's do this. Right. Again, repeat this. Advanced Marxism hold that it has found the true explanation for social, economic, and political life, and that a correct praxis follows from that knowledge. It follows that social life can be correctly grasped imminently in all of its objective necessity and thus controlled. In other words, you have the ability to control it. Once we understand the system, we understand the logic, the rules, and once we understand, we can uniformly control it, manage it. Because Marx and Engels, and certainly every Marxist capable of intellectual fanaticism, have a lively awareness of the contingencies of historical development. One cannot compare their science to the many attempts that have been made to apply the methods of natural science and exactitude to the problems of social philosophy and politics. In other words, the Marxist thing is in other words, we can't compare this. The typical attempt, then he goes, the other attempts to uh, have a lively awareness of the contingency of historical development, right? One cannot compare their science to the many attempts that have been made to apply methods of natural science and exactitude to the problems of social philosophy. Of course, vulgar Marxism is glad to claim a natural scientific exactness for its theories and the iron necessity produced by the laws of historic materialism. Many bourgeois social philosophers have concerned themselves with an attempt to refute that claim and prove that one cannot deal with historic events in the same way that astronomy can calculate the movements of the stars, and that in any case, even admitting the iron necessity, it would be particular to organize a political party for the achievement of a coming eclipse of the sun, right? But the rationalism of Marxist theory has another side, more important for the concept of dictatorship. This rationalism does not exhaust itself in a scientific that intends, with the help of natural laws and strict determinism, to produce a method that would be used to turn the laws of nature to mankind's advantage. As, for example, a technique is bound to an exact natural scientific method. Right? Um, in other words, this does not exhaust itself in the science, in a science that intends that because of these things we are determinism, strict determinism, right? That there is this technique that is bound to exact natural scientific method, right? If that were the scientific and socialism, then the leap to the realm of freedom would only be a leap into the realm of absolute technology, right? In other words, that you just have to go leap technology, technique, you know. It would have been only a remnant of an early Enlightenment rationalism, and another example of the attempt, much favored since the 18th century, to provide a politics of mathematical and physical exactness, with the sole difference that of with the sole difference that the powerful moralism that still dominated 18th century thought would be given up theoretically. Right, this idea. The results must be, as with all rationalism, a dictatorship of the leading rationalists. Right, this is the situation in that sense. The physically and metaphysically fascinating aspect of Marxist historic philosophy and sociology is not its similarity to natural science, but the way that Marx retains the concepts of a dialectical development of human history and observes this development as a concrete, unique, antithetical process. Antithetical process, producing itself through an imminent organic power. In other words, this idea. This is a very important part. It's no longer, in other words, this dialectic development, this is a struggle of dialectic that leads to this problem, right? To uniquely anti-theoretical, antithetical process, right? Producing itself through an immanent organic power. It changes nothing in the structure of his thought that he shifted this development into the area of economics and technology. In other words, instead of it being at the level of will, now it's moved to the question of economics, right, and technology. This is merely a transference that can be explained in various ways. For example, psychologically, from an intuition about the political importance of economic factors, or systemically from an attempt to make human activity the master of historic events and the master of the irrationality of human fate. The leap into the realm of freedom can only be understood dialectically. The leap into the realm of freedom can only be understood dialectically, right? It cannot be undertaken with the help of technique alone. So this technique alone does not get you to this realm of freedom. Otherwise, one could really demand of Marxist socialism that instead of political action, it would be better to invent new machines, right? New mechanisms, new institutions. No. If it's technology and this process of this, build new machines, right? It might be conceivable that the future communist societies, new technological and chemical discoveries might be made, which would again alter the foundations of communist society and makes revolution necessary. Right? This is idea. This is if it's pure science and new techniques, new science, new things, new chemistry, new things. That will. This is more like the argument in Brave New World rather than you know Huxley in Brave New World is kind of an enlightenment argument. Marxism was approached this way. Huxleyan view is not a Marxist position. Okay, so that's the difference between. In other words, if it was this purely this technology could solve it, but that's not the way. That's not how Marxists don't believe this, right? Finally, it is peculiar to assume for one and for all that this future society must give tremendous support to technological development, accelerating its tempo. On the other hand, be consistently protected from the dangers that a new organization of classes would pose. In other words, you have to be careful about this. You have to do this new technology, you have to prevent new classes. All of these objections are quite plausible, but they do not touch the heart of his theory. According to Marxist belief, humanity will become conscious of itself, and that will occur precisely by the means of the correct knowledge of social reality. In other words, it's the realization of under. This is what. In other words, it's that humanity once it become conscious will become conscious of itself, understand humanity only by understanding the correct social reality by means of the correct knowledge of social reality. Consciousness thus achieves an absolute character. This is that thing. This is there was that this idea of class. Was through class consciousness that we understand our sense. Only through understanding class, the conflict of classes, and gathering class consciousness, and then coming to that and overcoming the dialectic of having the proletarian revolution. Do you have the creation of a truly human consciousness? Right. This is the absolute consciousness, thus achieves a absolute character. Here it is a matter of, in other words, here it is a matter of rationalism that includes Hegelian evolution from within itself and finds its proof in its own concreteness, something of which the abstract rationalism Enlightenment was not capable. Marxist science does not want to attribute to the coming events the mechanical certainty of a mechanically calculated, mechanically constructed triumph. Rather, this is left to the flow of time and the concrete reality of historic events, which are producing themselves from out of themselves. In other words, it's not a mechanical structure of technology. It is rather what he says. It is left to the flow of history, right? History, time, out of concrete events of here, that therefore, which produce themselves from themselves. Okay? That's that line. Marx always knew with a that Marx always knew that with an understanding of concrete historicity, that an understanding of concrete historicity was an advantage, right? So you have to understand. But Hegel's rationalism had the courage to construct history itself. That's right. That's right. This is what Hegel's idea of rationality is the march of this moment of this. That this is in the, remember again, the master slave dialectic is in the phenomenology of spirit, not in the philosophy of history. The philosophy of history is only the historical emanations of the epochs that emerge out of this dialectic, the logic of the dialect of the master slave dialectic, right? That's the whole point of Hegel's. So Hegel's gives us a, in this sense, courage to construct the history, right? And an active person then could have no other interest than to grasp with absolute certainty current events and the contemporary epoch, right? To understand the moment, you have to understand the moment you're in. If you understand the logic of here, you just look at the moment you're in to understand circumstances, to understand what is going to happen next, right? That that was scientifically possible with the help of a dialectic construction of history. That's Marx, right? The science of Marxist socialism rests, therefore, on the principles of the Hegelian philosophy of history. This is to show not that Marx is dependent upon Hegel, and thus to increase the numerous analysis of the relationship, but rather in order to define the core of Marxist argument and its specific concept of dictatorship. One must begin with the connection between Hegel's historic dialectic and Marxist political theory. That will be shown. It will be shown that there is a particular kind of metaphysical evidence here that leads to a certain sociological constructions and to a rationalist dictatorship. So in other words, the metaphysical, in other words, the logic of the metaphysics in Hegel, of the historical development, leads us to construction of sociological, certain sociological, in other words, the elements of society, the structures of society and how they work, constructions, and to a rational dictatorship. So two things: a certain sociological construction of how the world is and should be, and a rationalist dictatorship to bring it about. Right? Two, the dictatorship and dialectical development. It is indeed difficult to connect. It is indeed difficult to connect dialectical development and dictatorship, because dictatorship seems to be an interruption of the continual series of development, a mechanical intervention in organic evolution. So therefore, in other words, if this is merely an evolutionary process, there's no need for intervention. Dictatorship is an interruption, an intervention, right, of this mechanical process. It's a mechanical intervention. It is being done to force something to happen, right? Development and dictatorship seem to be mutually exclusive. So, in other words, development assumes a simple process of evolution, of the process working out. Dictatorship is an intervention to force to mechanically force to do something else. The unending process of a world spirit that develops itself in contradictions must also include within itself even its own contradiction, dictatorship, and thus rob it of its essence, decision. Okay, that's right. Very interesting thing. In other words, the unending process of this world spirit, right, develops itself in contradictions that must include within itself even its own real contradiction. That's the dictatorship process. Dictatorship is what? An mechanical intervention that overturns the process, right? And a decision, again, that's a, and thus rob it of its essence, decision. There's no decision in Stork. This is just an inevitable process. Decision is a something, in other words, this is interesting. This line here. Development goes on without a break, and even interruption must serve it as negations so that the missing L here, be pushed further. The essential point is that an exception never comes from outside into the imminence of development. In other words, the essential point is that an exception never comes from outside. The exception is only has to be internal. In other words, something here that's it's because the process. If something that does, in other words, something exception, the exception never comes from outside into the imminence of development. Okay. Hegel's philosophy, in any case, was not concerned with dictatorship in the sense of a moral decision that interrupts the process of development or discussion. That's why it's like this. In other words, as dictatorship is not, Hegel does not care about dictatorship in that sense because the process is good. This process is going to work, and and anything that happens here is going to happen because of inside the system itself, not from some force outside going to impose itself. Right? That's right. This. Um, um, in other words, a sense of moral decision that interrupts the process of development or decision. Discussion, not decision. Discussion. Even the most contradictory things assert themselves. In other words, even the most contradictory things assert themselves and will be incorporated in the encompassing development. So, therefore, the contradictions are then what they're what do you call it? They are uh, 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 that is contradiction that assert themselves, right, will be incorporated in the encompassing development, right? The either or of moral decision, the decisive and deciding disjunction, has no place in the system. So this is what he means: that in this process of dialectic, there is no either or. There is no decision of either or of moral decision. And has no place. Even the diktat, the dictation of a dictator, becomes a moment in the discussion and in the undisturbed development of its development as it moves further. So the diktat, from this model, the diktat, the decision of a dictator is nothing more than what? One thing within the system, that one thing that's in the system. That's not that. Just as everything else, the dictate too will be assimilated by the pericilius of the world spirit. In other words, this um, the working, the inner working of the world spirit, in a sense, right? Hegel's philosophy contains no ethic. Hegel's philosophy contains no ethic that could provide a foundation for the absolute distinction between good and evil. What is good and evil? What is the distinction between good and evil? This is a very interesting point that Schmitt is raising here. That Hegel's thing is one sense, um, because of this process, the dictate of this, everything is within the system. It's going to be dialectic of this, right? That and there is no ethic of right and wrong, either or, right? That could provide a foundation for the absolute distinction between good and evil. According to this philosophy, the good is what is rational at the current station of the dialectical process, and thereby what is real. The real is irrational. The rational is real, right? And therefore, his argument is that every state of the dialectical process, well, the good is what is rational at this stage of the dialectical process, and therefore, thereby, what is real. Right? The rational is real, right? That's that. The real is rational, right? The rational is real, and the good is what is rational, what is real, right? At that stage of historic process. The good is, I accept Christian Genteski's pertinent formulation, the current. The good is the current, right? He's accepting Christian Janensky's pertinent formulation of this. Right? The good is the current, in the sense of being the correct dialectical knowledge and consciousness. So the good is what is true at this moment in reality, in the sense of being a correct dialectical knowledge and consciousness. And our consciousness is our understanding of what is, right? If world history is also the world court, let me see this 5. Yeah, this is the world core, translated or not, then it is a process without a last instance and without a definite disjunctive judgment. In other words, if history is just the court, well, this process, it is a process without a last instance or a definitive disjunctive judgment. Evil is unreal and only conceivable insofar as something out of date can be thought, and thus perhaps explicable as a false abstraction of reason, a passing confusion of a particularly closed in upon itself, a confusion of a particularity closed in upon itself. This is very interesting. The evil is unreal and only conceivable. So the good is what is rational and real at that moment of what he says using this. The good is the current, right? And world history is the ultimate court. There's no last judgment about is this definitive without a definitive disjunctive judgment, right? Thus, evil is unreal and only conceivable insofar as something out of date can be thought and thus perhaps explicated as a false, incorrect, abstraction of reasoning, a passing confusion of a particularity closed in upon itself. In other words, a misunderstanding, and this particular element doesn't understand the world around it, the situation of it, and therefore that is like this, right? Only within an at least theoretically small area to overcome what is out of date or to correct false appearances would a dictatorship be possible. So therefore, in this weird sense, in the Marxist situation, it's a self-correcting mechanism, right? In this Hegelian understanding, in other words, it's only because of this. It's an error has happened in the system, and therefore a dictatorship be possible. In this, in other words, to overcome what is out of date or to correct a false appearance, right? And the theoretically small, this micro small area, right? It would be something peripheral. It would be something peripheral and accidental, not in the essential negation of. This is interesting. It would be something peripheral and incidental, not the essential negation of the essential, but the removal of an inconsequential bit of rubbish. In other words, this dictatorship is not going to be a big thing. It's going to be what? Something peripheral and accidental. This error, this evil is going to be something peripheral and incidental. And not a negation. It's not an essential negation of something essential, but a removal of inconsequential bit of rubbish. In contrast to Fichte's rational philosophy, here a despotism is rejected. Right against Fichte, Hegel argued that it would be a violent abstraction to assume that the world had been abandoned by God and was only waiting until mankind could bring a purpose to it and build it according to an abstract motion of how things ought to be, right? So I'll make sure this is Hegel's philosophy, right? Fichte never achieves the idea of reason and is complete real unity of subject and object, of ego and non-ego. For him, it is merely an ought or an aim, right? This is in that sense. So this is what Hegel. Now, Fichte argued that you can do it. We can do it. Fichte says that we are human willing. That creates an end because God no longer provides it, right? So therefore, against Fichte, Hegel argued that the world would be a violent abstraction. It would be a violent abstraction to assume that the world has been abandoned by God and was only waiting until mankind could bring a purpose onto it and building according to an abstract notion of how things should be. And ought is impotent. What is right will make itself effective, and what merely should be without actually existing is not true, but only a subjective mastery of life, right? So therefore, in other words, something should be, this is a subjective mastery of life. I'm trying to do this. In other words, what is right will make itself effective. And what merely should be without actually existing is not true, but is only a subjective mastery of this, right? The most important advance that the 19th century made over the rationalism of the 18th rests on this contrast between Hegel and Fichte. A dictatorship that had become impossible because the absolute character of moral disjunction had never been dissolved. It became impossible because the absolute character of moral disjunction had been dissolved, right? So therefore, this idea that nevertheless, Hegel's philosophy remained only a logical development and intensification of the old rationalism. So Hegel was basically just taking the old rationalism and just pumping up, right? The logical development and intensification of this. The conscious human act first make the conscious human act first makes people what they are and propels them out of the natural finitude of an in itself onto the higher level of a for itself. Okay, in other words, this moment, in other words, that the logical development of the moment is that the human acts, that the conscious human acts first makes people what they are and propels them out of their natural finitude of an I'm in itself for what it's for, right? What man is accordingly to his aptitude and ability, he must first become aware of. So must what a man is according to his aptitude and ability, he must first become aware of, so that he does not remain trapped in a merely accidental and capricious empirical existence. so that the irresistible motions of world historical events do not pass him by. So in other words, this idea. In other words, he doesn't become an accident, destructible. He must first know what he is and what he's for, and by knowing that, he does not remain trapped in an accidental and capricious existence, right? And because if he's trapped in that, then irresistible motions, so that the irresistible motion of human historical events do not pass him by. So long as this philosophy remains com, com, okay, contemplative, so long as this philosophy remained contemplative, it had no place for dictatorship in any case. But that changes as soon as it is taken seriously by active people. So there was this once it's simply this as a contemplative thing, dictatorship has no place. As long as it's this philosophy remains contemplative, it has no place. But that changes the second that you have, in other words, as soon as it's taken seriously by active people. In material, political, and sociological praxis, action, right? Those who have a higher consciousness and who believe themselves to be representatives of this great force will shake off the constraints of a narrow outlook and will enforce the objectively necessary. Okay, this is like this: in material, political, and sociological praxis, right? Activity, action. Those who have this higher consciousness and who believe themselves representative of this historical consciousness, this great force, will shake off this contemplative view and will enforce what enforce the objectively necessity. Here too their will forces the unfree to be free. In practice, that is an educational dictatorship, right? The teacher, the parent. Right? This is in other words, in practice, this is an educational dictatorship. But if world history is to go forward, if the unreal must be continually defeated, then by necessity the dictatorship would become permanent. In other words, if history is going to go forward and the unreal, those moments of contradiction in the system, must be continually defeated. Remember that thing about that, that problem he mentioned earlier, right? That in the Marxist system, the unreal is a localized event that is simply just like this, and dictatorship is necessary to set the thing right, right? Then, therefore, this dictatorship becomes permanent, right? Here, it is also clear that the universal duality, which, according to Hegel's philosophy, can be found in everything that happens, rests above all in itself. The concept of development can eliminate dictatorship just as it would declare a permanent dictatorship. So it would eliminate, in other words, the dictatorship of the proletariat is permanent, but then once the man is evolved, there's no longer that, and the dictatorship will dissolve, right? So, in other words, this is the state. The concept of the development itself, this idea, right, can eliminate the dictatorship just as it could declare the permanent one. For the actions of people, there is always the argument that the highest level of consciousness can and must exercise domination over the lower. So that the consciousness dominates, the higher consciousness dominates the lower things, right? So therefore, in the actions of people, the highest level of consciousness must exercise domination over this. Right? That's it. In political and practical terms, that is the equivalent of a rationalist educational dictatorship. But in Hegelism, like every rationalist system, thus negates the individual as accidental and is inessential and elevates the whole system into an absolute. So that's the whole point, right? Hegelism, like everything, that it negates the role of the particular and it focuses on the systemic and elevates everything as absolute. The Weltgeist, this world spirit, right, only manifests itself in a few minds at any stage of its development, right? This only a few minds are going to, this world spirit that there is, this world geist is going to, at any point in time, only few minds are going to manifest itself. The spirit of an age does not thrust itself into the awareness of every person at a single stroke, nor does it appear in all members of the dominant nation or social group. There will always be a vanguard of the Weltgeist, the world spirit, an apex of the development of consciousness, an avant garde that has the right to act because it possesses the correct knowledge and consciousness, not not as the chosen of a personal God, but as a movement in development. So that's what I said. In other words, in other words, this idea, this is the vanguard, the people, those people whose minds are manifested by this Weltgeist, the world spirit. This is, and it's not going to be everyone getting it. It's going to be only a vanguard. He says, right? A vanguard will have this. But that vanguard, therefore, has what? At apex of development of they are the vanguard of this, of the people who have the apex of that development of consciousness. An avant-garde that has the right to act because it possesses correct knowledge and consciousness. Not as a, and this is not a chosen person of a personal God, but merely the world, the system itself. In other words, not a God from outside who elects to do this, rather the system itself necessitates it because these people are accessing the world geist, the world spirit. Uh, um, this vanguard does not wish to escape from the imminence of world historic evolution at all, but is, according to the vulgar image, the midwife of the coming things. So therefore, those who have the moment like this, that they are just simply the people that mediate the coming into being of the world geist, right? They're the midwife. In other words, they do not wish to escape this, right? They wish to bring it to be, right? The world historic personalities, Theseus, Caesar, Napoleon, is an instrument of the Weltgeist, the spirit. His dictate rests on his position in the historical moment. The decision, the dictate, the decision, that thing is nothing more than his role, his position in this dark moment. The world soul that Hegel saw writing by in Jena in 1806 was a soldier, not a Hegelian. Okay, this is soldier as a soldier. The Battle of Jena, which Napoleon defeated the combined forces of Russia and Prussia, was fought as Hegel completed his Phenomenology of Geist. Historians usually date the end of the Holy Roman Empire and the German nation from 1806. And also Hegel, the German Constitution, right? Um, on October 13, 1806, Hegel wrote in a letter, "I saw Napoleon, the soul of the world, riding through the town on a reconnaissance. It was indeed wondrous to see, concentrated at my point, sitting on a horse, an individual who overruns the world and masters it." Right. So, in other words, it was not a Hegelian. It was the world soul that Hegel saw it was a soldier. Right. It was the representative of the alliance between philosophy and the saber, but only from the side of the saber. It was Hegelians' conscience of knowing of their own time correctly who demanded a political dictatorship in which they naturally would become the dictators. In no way different from Fichte, they were ready to prove to the world that their view was infallible. That gave them the right to dictatorship. And that's 8 again, footnote 8. This is, I think, the translator note. Yeah, the young Hegelians. This is a thing about the young Hegelians, right? And he said, sees Charles Taylor's book Hegel. Okay. Again, that's the translator's little note. I think on last chapter, part 3, dictatorships and dialectics in Marxist socialism. The interpretation of Hegel's philosophy presented here, that is, a side whose practical consequences can lead to a rational dictatorship, also holds true for Marxism. And certainly in the kind of proof on which the metaphysical certainty of dictatorship is founded it has contained completely within the spheres of Hegelian, sorry, in the spheres of Hegelian pardon me, completely within the spheres of Hegelian historical consciousness. Because Marx's scientific theories later developed almost exclusively into national economic interests, that was also, as will momently be shown, a consequence of Hegel's thought. And because the decisive concept of class had not yet been worked into the philosophy of history and the sociological system, a superficial observation can shift the essence of Marxism into the materialist theory of history. In other words, a superficial observation can shift the essence of this into a material theory of history. But the real historical construction already appears in the Communist Manifesto, whose lines have always remained fundamental. That world history is the history of class struggle, has already been known for a long time. The Communist Manifesto offers nothing really new in this respect. And by 1848, the bourgeois was already long familiar as a figure of spite. Scarcely any significant literature of that time did not use the word as a system of abuse. Again, that's a note there. What was new and fascinating in the Communist Manifesto was something else. The systemic concentration of class struggle into a single final struggle of human history, into a dialectical peak of tension between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The contradictions of many classes were thus simplified into a struggle, a single final contradiction, right? It's in place of many earlier classes, even in place of 3 classes identified by Ricardo: capitalist, landowner, and wage worker, and accepted by Marx in the details of political economies and capital. Right, this is Ricardo. But in other words, in place of the early classes, in other words, in place of many earlier classes, even in place of the 3 classes identified by Ricardo, and accepted by Marx in detail in his political economy and capital, right? There appears a single class contradiction. This simplification signified a powerful increase in intensity, two classes, right, between the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means, and the workers, right, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. It asserted itself with systemic and methodological necessity. Because the process of development is dialectical and therefore logical, even if the basis remains economics, a simple antithesis must emerge in the last crucial, absolutely decisive turning point of world history. This last moment, this last turning, right? In this way, the greatest tension of world historical moments arise. Um, Here, I wish to God uh, 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 Parvini read this. This is right the point. In other words, if you only accept doom or revolution in this idea of fraternality, is you accept this Hegelian dialectical model, which then there is this moment, this lateral crisis, this final contradiction that then leads us to the end of contradiction. Right? That's the end of history in that sense. Right? Um, this simplification signified a powerful increase in intensity. It asserted itself systemic and methodological necessity. Because the process of development is dialectical and therefore logical, even if its basis remains economics, a simple antithesis must emerge at the last critical, absolute, decisive turning point of world history. In this way, the greatest tension of world historical moments arise. There's only two left. There it is, last one. This is the greatest moment. On this logical simplification rests the final intensification, not only of real struggle, but also of theoretical contradictions. Everything must be forced to an extreme so that it can be overturned out of dialectical necessity, right? Everything was put to extreme. The contradiction must be good, so that therefore the extreme and then therefore the dialectical necessity will force it at a resolution, right? The most monstrous wealth must confront the most horrific misery. The class that owns everything must face the class that owns nothing. The bourgeois who only possesses, who only has, and who is no longer human opposes the proletarian who has nothing and who is nothing but a person. Without the dialectics of Hegel philosophy, it is completely unimaginable that, on the basis of all previous experience of history, this process of pauperization had gone on for centuries, and that kind humankind would finally either sink under the weight of universal oppression, or a new mass migration would change the face of the earth. Right? This is, in other words, in other words, human history would say that oppression would either they would succumb to it or they'd flee. Right? They would succumb or flee. Right? That's what human history would taught us. Right? And therefore, this would change the face of the earth. The communist society of the future, the higher stage of a classless humanity, is thus only evident when socialism retains the structure of Hegelianism dialectics. Then the inhumanity of the capitalist social order must of necessity produce its own negation from within itself. Schmitt understands Marxists better than the Marxists here. This is right. In other words, the capitalist system must go to its extreme logic of inhumanity, and only then can the contradiction that this get the negation of itself from within itself. Under the influence of this dialectic, Lassalle had also tried to push this tension to an antithetical extreme. Even if he was more motivated by rhetorical rather than theoretical interest when he replied to Schultz Delitzsch. In other words, replied to Schultz Delitzsch. Ricardo is the greatest theorist of bourgeois economy. He led it to its summit, to a precipice, where his only theoretical development left to it was the transformation into social economy. Yeah, this is the note. This is her note again. The bourgeoisie must therefore reach its most extreme intensification before it appears certain that its last hour has come. Lassalle and Marx are in complete agreement about this essential conception. The simplification of contradictions fall into a final absolute class conflict. First brings about a critical moment of the dialectical process. But still, where does the certainty come from that the moment has arrived, and that this is the last hour of the bourgeoisie? In other words, where does this certainty come from? This is the problem. Okay, this may be true, but why now is this? Why is this now? Where does this certainty come from? If one examined the kind of evidence Marxists used to argue the point, a tautology that is typical for Marxist, for Hegelian rationalism, will immediately be recognizable, right? Once we carefully, in other words, once examine the evidence that they make about this, right? The construction starts from the assumption that the evolution of a constantly increasing consciousness means, and its own certainty of this consciousness is offered as evidence for it, that it's correct. So, in other words, this is that the construction starts from the assumption that an evolution of a constantly increasing consciousness means, and its own certainty of this consciousness is offered as evidence for it, that it is correct. So it's a self-identifying thing, right? The dialectic construction of the increasing consciousness forces the constructing thinker to think himself with his thought at the peak of this development, right? He's at the peak. He has now he's thinking, oh my God, this is this idea that this must be the peak of this melt. For him, that means at the same time the attainment of his own perfect knowledge of the phases of the historic past which lay behind him. He would not think correctly and would contradict himself if this development were not most deeply conscious of itself in his thought. In other words, he had to be aware of it. He's aware of it. It's there. It's present. He sees that this is the moment. Okay, this is. If an epoch can be grasped in human consciousness, then that furnishes proof for a historical dialectic that this epoch is finally finished. Right? For the face of the thinker is turned towards the historical, that is, toward the past and the passing present. Right? Nothing is more false than the popular belief that Hegelianisms believed they could foresee the future like a prophet. They can't foresee the future. This is nothing is more false than the popular belief that Hegelians believed they could foresee the future like a prophet. The thinker, however, only knows coming things correctly in a negative, as the dialectical contradictions of what is already historically finished. He discovers the past as a development into the present, which he sees in its continuous evolution. And if he has correctly understood it and correctly constructed it, then there is the certainty that this, a thing known perfectly, belongs to the consciousness of the stage that has already been overcome and whose last hour has finally arrived. Right? This is like this. This is how they know it. It proves itself. I've seen this. I've seen the process. I know this. Oh, my stage it's come. It's over. It's going to happen here. In other words, then there is a certainty that the stage, a thing known perfectly, belongs to the consciousness of a stage that has already been overcome and whose last hour has been achieved. In spite of expressions such as iron necessity, Marx did not calculate coming things as an astronomer calculates the coming constellations of the stars. In the same way, he was not what a psychological journalism tries to make him out, a Jewish prophet who prophesies future catastrophe. That Marx has a powerful moral pathos that influences argument and descriptions is not difficult to recognize. But it is not specific to Marx any more than a venomous contempt for the bourgeoisie anything more. In other words, there's nothing specific in Marx than more than a venomous contempt for the bourgeoisie. Both can be found in various non-socialists as well. Marx's achievement was to lift the bourgeois out of the sphere of aristocratic and literary resentment and elevate him into a world conscious, world historical figure who must be absolutely inhuman, not in a moral sense, but in the Hegelian sense, in order to appeal from an immediate necessity to the good and absolutely human as its contradiction. In other words, this idea the bourgeois is no longer this thing; he has to be turned into the absolute inhuman in order to in order to appeal the immensely necessity to the good and absolutely human in its contradiction, just as just as Hegel argues that it can be said of the Jewish people that precisely because they stand directly before the gates of heaven, that they are the most prolific. Number 12, because they stand before the gates of heaven, they are the most prolific. Right? That again, this is in his the phenomenology of Geist. Hegel says this, right? Um, in Marxist terms, it can only be said of the proletariat that it will be absolute negation of the bourgeoisie. It would be an unscientific, in other words, in Marxist terms, it can only be said that the proletariat, said of the proletariat, that it would be the absolute negation of the bourgeoisie. It would be an unscientific socialism if a description of the proletarian state of the future were to be painted into this picture. In other words, it only says the scientific aspect of this, the Marxist term that the proletarian will be the absolute negation of this. It's unscientific to argue what does that proletarian state should look like. It is a systemic necessity that everything affecting the proletariat only allows itself to be negatively determined. Only when one has completely forgotten that one has attempted to determine the proletarian positively. Accordingly, all that can be said about the future society is that it will have no class contradictions. And the proletarian can only be defined as the social class that no longer participates in profit, that owns nothing, that knows no ties to family or fatherland, and so forth. The proletarian becomes the social non-entity. Now, this is 13. This is his note. 13 is a note by thing. This is not merely a figure of speech. A social non-entity is a possibility in society, then that it proves specifically that no social order exists. There can be no social order that contains such a vacuum. There's no order, no power. There can be no social order. This is kind of a known entity, right? The proletarian becomes a social non-entity. He must be what? He must be, as there's no one out there, there's no other class that exists. It no longer participates in profit, that owns nothing, that it knows no ties to family or fatherland. The proletarian becomes this non-entity, no social, no entity. It must also be true that the proletarian, in contrast to the bourgeoisie, is nothing but a person. From this, it follows with dialectic necessity that in the period of transition, he can be nothing but a member of his class. That is, he must realize himself precisely as something that is in contradiction, that is the contradiction of humanity in the class. The class contradiction must become the absolute contradiction. So all other contradictions can absolutely overcome and disappear into pure humanity. This is the logic. The Marxist tautology. The scientific certainty of Marxism, therefore, only relates to the proletarian negatively conceived, insofar as it is economically the dialectic contradiction of the bourgeoisie. In contrast, the bourgeoisie must be known positively and in its full historicity, because its essence lies in the economic. Marx has to follow it into the economic realm in order to understand it fully and in its essence. So because of this, he has to go in the economic realm. In other words, insofar economically, the dialectical contradiction of the bourgeoisie, right? It's negatively, it's only economically, because in contrast, the bourgeoisie must be known positively and fully historicity, and because of this, it lies in economics, right? If he could succeed, he if he could know the bourgeoisie absolutely, then what would prove that the bourgeoisie belonged to history, that it was finished, that it represented a stage of development, the spirit that had consciously overcome? For the scientific claim of Marx, for the scientific claim of Marxist socialism, it is really a question of life and death, right? How do you know that this is this endpoint? Is this contradiction? Whether it is possible to analyze the bourgeoisie correctly and to grasp it intellectually. Is it possible to do this, right? This is life and death for this, right? Whether it's possible to analyze this bourgeois. Here is the deepest motive for the demonic assiduity with which Marx delved into economic questions. In other words, he dwelled in economic questions to know the absolute bourgeoisie in this sense. Demonic acidity that Marx developed into the economic question. It has already been objected against him that while he hoped to discover the natural laws of economic and social life, his researches were limited almost exclusively to the industrial conditions of England as the classical site of capitalist modes of production. Okay, no, that's not the. Moreover, his discussion remained limited to goods and values, and therefore the concept of bourgeois capitalism. He thus remains trapped in classical and therefore bourgeois political economy. In other words, this is his whole economics was the bourgeois model. He's trapped within it. Okay, this is the laugh of this. How can you understand it then? If you're stuck within it. How can you understand? You can only really understand it from the outside, but you can't. You're understanding it in this terms of economics, and therefore you're within therefore the bourgeois political economy. Such accusations would be correct if the specifically scientific character of Marxism were to rest exclusively on sharp analysis, right? But science here means the consciousness of an evolutionary metaphysics that makes consciousness into the criterion of progress. So therefore, it's not just this. It's not an understanding of this. It is this model of consciousness that is tied, that is evolutionary. In other words, here the consciousness of an evolutionary metaphysics that makes consciousness into the criterion of progress. The fantastic urgency with Marx returns again and again to the bourgeois economy is therefore neither an academic theoretical fanaticism nor a simple tactical interest of his opponent. This instance derives from a theoretical metaphysical compulsion. A correct consciousness is the criteria for the beginning of the new stage of development. In other words, you have to have the right consciousness. You have to have the right moment. And until you have that consciousness, you can't have the new development, right? Next, the new stage of development. So long as this is not the case, so long as a new epoch is not really at hand, then the previous epoch, that is, the bourgeois epoch, cannot be correctly known, and vice versa. That the bourgeoisie is correctly understood again provides the essence that it provides the evidence that its era is at an end. In other words, only when you understand it, then you know it's at its end, right? And it's done. It's over. It's over. We know it. Oh, we see it completely. We understand it. We understand we're there, and therefore this is at this extreme point like this, right? The tautology of Hegelianism, which, as well as that of Marxism, certainly moves in such circles and provides a self-guarantee of its own truth. And this is great. This is where this is Schmitt. Then this really just tears apart Hegel at this moment, and by Marx, of the tautology of the system, of this master-slave dialectic, is a tautology in that sense, right? In fact, the claim of the real is rational and rational is real is an A and A, tautology. Therefore, this is that very interesting thing in this sense, right? Um, in other words, the tautology of Hegel, as well as the Marxist certainty, moves in such circles and provides the self-guarantee of its own truth. The scientific certainty that the historical moment of the proletariat has arrived is first produced, therefore, by a correct understanding of the process of development. The bourgeoisie cannot grasp the proletariat, but the proletariat can certainly grasp the bourgeoisie. With this, the sun begins to set on the age of the bourgeoisie. The owl Minerva begins its flight. But here, that does not mean that the arts and sciences have progressed, but rather that the passing age has become an object of historical consciousness of a new epoch, right? Perhaps in its final state, a Marxist humanity, one that has come into its own, will not be distinguishable from the final goal envisioned by the rationalist educational dictation for mankind. We need not follow the speculation any further. The rationalism that also incorporated world history into its construction certainly has its greatest dramatic moments, but its intensity ends in a fever, and it no longer sees the idyllic paradise before its eyes, which the naive optimism of the Enlightenment saw, and which Condorcet saw in the sketch of the development of the human race. And in the apocalypse of the Enlightenment, right? This is that 15. Yes, Concordance tableau, history tableau, Concordance refutes Rousseau's thesis in the discourse on the arts and sciences, that knowledge and cultivation of the arts and sciences had led to a denigration of morals. In Concordate's view, progress is identical with knowledge and the struggle against superstition, priests, and error. Significantly, he identifies the discovery of printing as the instrument that created a new tribunal of public opinion. In the last epoch, Concordant asks, could there not come a time when the well-being of the populace would start to deteriorate, and when, in contrast to the steady progress of all previous ages, there would be a retrograde movement, at least as a kind of moment between good and evil, beyond which no further improvement is possible? This is that's there's no further movement is possible. The translator then gives a note to a book about French liberal thought. Hold on. The new rational destroys itself dialectically, and before it stands a terrible. The new rational destroys itself dialectically, and before it stands a terrible negation. The kind of force to which it must resort cannot any longer be Fichte's naive schoolmasterly educational dictation. The bourgeois is not to be educated, but eliminated. Hey, you genocidal, class side. It must not be educated. It must be exterminated. Right? Exterminated. This is the danger of this. This is the dehumanization of ideology in a sense. The struggle, a real and bloody struggle that arises, requires a different chain of thought and different intellectual constitution from the Hegelian construction, whose core always remain contemplative. So the Hegel one is contemplative. There's no genocide in Hegel or classicide in Hegel. Okay, this is it's contemplative. This is going to happen like this. It's going to be good. Well, you turn it to Marx, it's going to be sausage making. The Hegelian construction remains the most important intellectual factor here. And almost every work by Lenin and Trotsky demonstrates how much energy and tension it can still generate. It has become only an intellectual instrument for what is no longer a rationalist impulse. The parties to the struggle that has broken out between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat has assumed a concrete shape, just as an intellectual just as the just as an actual struggle demands. A philosophy of material life offered an intellectual weapon for this purpose, a theory that saw every intellectual discovery as secondary compared to a deeper, more vital, emotional, and voluntary course of events that corresponds to a frame of mind in which the categories receive morals, the governance of the unconscious by the conscience. Morals are the governance of the unconscious by the conscious, right? Of instinct by reason, had been shaken to their very core, right? So this idea that the material life has shaken the deeper structure of this very core. A new theory of the direct use of force arose in opposition to the absolute rationalism of an educational dictatorship and to the relative rationalism of division of powers. So therefore, this dialectical rationalism, this dialectical thinking, and this consciousness of this idea of consciousness, and that you've understood this new reality. It's no longer merely, and that this must be a negation of the other thing, right, of the bourgeoisie, means that there is not an educational aspect of it. It's negation, not its elimination, not its education. And therefore, what you get in this sense is no longer the absolute rationalism of the educational dictatorship or the relative rationalism of division of powers, right? Against the belief in discussion, there appears a theory of direct action. So no longer discussion or deliberation, action. Not only were the foundations of parliamentarism attacked, but so too the democracy that always remained, at least in theory, part of the rationalist dictatorship, right? As Trotsky justly reminded the democratic Trotsky, the awareness of relative truth never gives one the courage to use force or to spill blood. 16. I'm going to read this note. Yeah, this is a note. This is in a conversation made 12/8/1982. Carl Schmitt emphasized the importance of this last sentence of his discussion of contemporary politics. And for the appreciation for the dilemma, he sought to clarify the text. The liberal system is a dialectic, but it only allows dictatorship in the form of education. This alone breaks into its discussion. For Hegel, dialectics was a means for the analysis of a society, but Marx transforms this Gesellschaft analyzation of Gesellschaft into class war, Klassenkampf. This struggle needs no education. Rather, it is a war in which the enemy will be destroyed. German words, in Krieg, die dem die Freund vernichten worden. This transforms Hegel philosophy into a political theology, Schmitt says. I mean, the translator doesn't, doing the letter, right? About the last sentence of this chapter, Schmitt condemns, it is a matter of life and death. Marx understood his enemy, the bourgeois liberal, better than he understood himself. Schmitt went on to quote Bruno Brenner, only the man who knows his prey better than it knows itself can trap it. And that ends the chapter. Well, we end here. It's been a long one, so I think we're going to say, oh, why is this long? Why didn't you break it up when you did the other one? Because the Marxist thing had to be worked together. Well, I stop here. If you have any comments or questions, please put it below in the things, and once I see them, I'll respond to them. If you liked it, like it. Hit the like button, hit it. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. Encourage others to subscribe. If you didn't like it, you can always say, no, I didn't like it, but say why in the comments. So maybe I can learn something. Yes, I have interruptions. I'm getting old. I'm an old man. You can follow me on my links to social media, links below. Also, for those of you who are interested in my academic social media, my stuff about my research and things that I do, links below. If you want to help me to do what I do here through a contribution through links to Subscribe Star and Patreon is below. Please, it'll help. I mean, honestly, you're getting this free. It would be nice if someone said, oh, that what you've gotten here is worth something. Maybe it is. Maybe it's not worth shit, right? I'm not going to give you any money. Okay, whatever. I wish that was the case. Oh, you can buy one of my books listed below. In that sense, that's the other way you can help me materially. In that sense, okay, that's it. I hope to see you again next time. We'll finish the Schmitt's Parliamentary by looking at the fourth part on the irrationalist theories of the direct use of force. Right. So take care. See you there. Again, this is on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And on Wednesdays and Wednesdays, Rousseau. Okay? Take care. Bye-bye.